What are we going to be learning in this class? We have the Maharal, and then we have the Rambam, discovering who these people are, what they did, what they wrote, what they taught, and the Arizal. We will be covering the teachings of some other great scholars, but we won't necessarily be mentioning them by name. This class is going to have a bit of a philosophical structure. We're going to be approaching the concept with a bit of a philosophical angle, even though Kabbalah is not necessarily supposed to be considered philosophical. Kabbalah is a tradition which is received from generation to generation, but in order to give us clarity and perspective, understanding of exactly what the entire cosmic evolution of spiritual realms and the different reasons why everything exists, will give a bit of a philosophical background, which does have its place in Kabbalistic works and writings, and that will explain to us and shed some light on the Kabbalah of it. If throughout this class you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop them in the comments. We're going to be exploring some questions like, what is God? Very important question. Why did God create the universe? So let's begin with Maimonides, Rambam, who was a great scholar in northern Africa. He had to move a lot throughout his life because of different wars and different crusades of different types. Eventually, he was a doctor. I believe it was in the court of Salah al-Din. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Great Muslim conqueror. And eventually, he moved to Egypt also. I think that was around the same time. And he was buried in northern Israel. So what are the teachings of the Rambam? The Rambam is a great thinker, philosopher, great writer, wrote on many different topics. So we have the Rambam's description of God. So how does God know? How does God manage the world? What is God? So the way the Rambam presents it, Maimonides, is that the way everything exists within God is in God's knowledge. In other words, how does God control the world? How does God manage the world? Using his knowledge. When God knows something in a certain direction, in other words, God knew the world, so to speak, into existence. Everything is happening within God's knowledge. And that knowledge is one with God. It's not something separate. It's not like you have two things, like us humans. We have us, and then we have the way we understand things. It's two different things. But with God, it's one. God is singular. You can't say that there's multiplicity in God. That's a topic which, obviously, those of us who are familiar with this channel know is a very basic topic and a very basic concept in Kabbalah and in general. This is rough translation. He, his knowledge, and his life are one. In other words, God is an absolute singularity. There's no multiplicity in God. God is perfect. God is singular. God is infinite. And with all that, we say that it's beyond understanding, because we cannot understand how it's possible for something to know itself from within itself without, so to speak, the power. What does it mean that you are the power of knowledge? That's what you are, and that's how you know. Us humans, there's me, there's how I process information, that's how I know things. But with God, it's all one. We don't really understand how that works. It's a singularity. Singularity doesn't make sense. It's when you have a whole bunch of things mushed together and you can't really differentiate. It's just one pure, infinite being. So this is the description that Maimonides gives for God. If you have any questions on this, for more clarification, please do drop those in the comments. And now we will move on. That's his explanation of what God is. How does he come to this conclusion philosophically? If you think about it, that is the minimum, so to speak, that God can be. How does he come to that conclusion? Because you have a world full of physicality and creations. So if you think about this philosophically, you want to try to build and understand from your own experience, from everything that we have available to us as humans. We want to understand how this all came to be, how it exists. So we understand that it comes from an infinite source. And there's a whole process how Maimonides, the Rambam, explains this. There's some Aristotle being quoted over there. Obviously, the Rambam doesn't necessarily take the position of Aristotle, but the conclusion is that the minimum, so to speak, that we can understand God What is it? What is he? He is he is knowledge, and one with that knowledge to an infinite level, which again, as we said, cannot necessarily be understood. It's the ultimate of all existence, and God creates the world, puts it into being. So that's the opinion of Maimonides Rambam. Then we have Maharal. And again, if you have any questions, please do drop them in the comments. We will get to them. So Maharal is going to disagree with this approach. Who is Maharal? Maharal was a European rabbi, lived in Prague, also a very deep thinker, wrote many books, and was a leader of the community. Sorry for all the noise. We are in Brooklyn, as many of you know. So in this image is not, there's not necessarily a depiction of the Maharal. I don't know if this is very accurate. In the city of Prague, he is still remembered till today. You have these statues of what we call a golem, which is like a fake human being, a statue, a person made of clay. Again, sorry for the noise. So if you go to Prague today, the city of Prague, you'll see all the shops, they sell these statues called the golem. That is because Maharal made a golem to protect the community from different blood libels that were happening in his day and age. He was a very respected rabbi. There's a statue of him, I think it's in the town hall, very respected rabbi in the city of Prague. So Maharal takes a different approach and disagrees with the approach of Rambam, and says God is not one with knowledge. In other words, you can't say that what is God? God is knowledge, even if you say that God, that it's infinite and that it's beyond our understanding, because knowledge is something. It's something specific. It's a very defined thing. You can't say that that's what God is. Instead, God is completely beyond any definition. And God creates knowledge and uses it to relate. So it is true that perhaps, how does God know everything that's happening in the world? Through something called knowledge. But that is a creation of God. You can't say that this is what God is, and God is one with that thing, and it's part of his unification. The Rambam said that because we need to say that God, so to speak, has a tool with which to relate, control, and act with the world, and that would be knowledge. And since you can't say there's multiplicity in God, he says that it's a singularity and it's one with God. Maharal says no, you can't say that there is something which is one with God. God is the only ultimate being, and everything else comes from God. Even knowledge itself is created by God, and perhaps that is how God relates to reality. But God is completely beyond any specific definition like knowledge. That is the opinion of the Maharal. Now, let's see how this conversation, this debate, sheds light on the Kabbalah. We know that the Kabbalah has the cosmic evolution of spiritual realms known as Hishtalshlus. We describe many different levels that God creates in order to bring forth reality. So it might be hard to understand, why do all these levels need to exist? So here, through looking at this conversation, this debate, which we just saw, we will understand it. So here we have Kabbalah. So we just spoke about the debate of the Maharal and the Rambam. So Arizal, which is one of the most fundamental Kabbalists of all time, also lived in northern Africa, in Egypt, and moved to the city of Tzefas. So the Arizal, being one of the most fundamental Kabbalists, obviously there's much more concepts, as we will be seeing throughout this class, that Kabbalah discusses beyond God's knowledge. But Arizal agrees with Rambam, with Maimonides' approach, that God is one and he's a singularity with his knowledge, but that's only true in the world of Atzilus. In the world of Atzilus. What is Atzilus? If you're not familiar with the concept, There's obviously many videos on this channel which discuss it. Atzilus is this world, so to speak, this spiritual realm, this spiritual dimension where God creates 10 Sefirot. What are these Sefirot? Sefirot are abilities, things with which God relates with all of creation, and God creates all of reality from these 10 Sefirot. This fits perfectly with the position of Rambam. Rambam says that God manages and creates and works with the world through his knowledge, and that's exactly in the Sefirot, in the 10 Sefirot. The first three are wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So these are, so to speak, God's abilities with which God interacts with the world. God creates knowledge. Kabbalah agrees with Maharal that God creates knowledge, but then God goes and unifies, becomes one with this knowledge. This is a very significant concept, as we will see. And why is this very significant? Why is this very meaningful? Atzilus can be thought of God himself, as we saw in the Rambam. The Rambam said that God is one with his knowledge. This is what we know about God. God, you can't say there's multiplicity in God, so you can't say there's other things in God. So there's obviously a singularity state of God and his knowledge. So the same thing is with Atzilus. God has these abilities. God creates with them. So God is in a singularity state with these abilities, God's abilities, so to speak, to create. So think about us as humans. We learn, we build things, we're innovative. We do that all with different abilities that we have inside of us, and those are really part of us. That's what we are. It's just that as humans, we're made of many parts. With God, you can't say he's made of parts, so it has to be singularity. But that's essentially what Atzilus is. Atzilus is this state of being where there's God's abilities and God is unified, one with these abilities which he uses to create all of reality. These are God's abilities to relate to the world, and they are one with him. So now we have a parallel, a philosophical way to understand and think of Atzilus. What is Atzilus? Why does God create these abilities? In order to relate to the world, and you can think of it in a sense as being one with God. But on the other hand, God is far beyond that, as we will see now. As it is written in Kabbalistic texts, the distance between God and Atzilus. So here we have the infinity of God, and then we have the world of Atzilus. In other words, God's created abilities in order to relate to the world is greater than the distance between us and Atzilus. So let's think about this for a moment. We just said that God is in a singularity state with these abilities to create. Us humans, we have knowledge, and that's something separate from us. God has knowledge, and it's unified with God. It's one. It doesn't create multiplicity in God. It's one with God, to the extent that Rambam thought of this as God himself. So this state of being, where you have the Sefirot, where you have God's abilities to relate to the world, is further from God's essence than we are from Atzilus. In other words, the tools with which God unifies in order to create us are further from God than they are to us. So when we look at these tools that God creates, we can mistakenly think about them as God himself, because they're infinite, they're singular, they're singularity, they're unified with God, they're one with God, so we can think of them as God himself. Tells us Kabbalah that no, there's an infinitely greater distance between Atzilus and God than there is between Atzilus and us. And that's the source over there if you want to go peek it. Even more so, Atzilus is like physical creation to God. This knowledge of God, which God manages the world with, is like physical creation to God. It's equal. This is what different Kabbalistic sources tell us, as you can see in that source. So now let's move on to understand this. How is this possible? How is it possible that we have this state of existence where you can think of it as one with God, unified with God, to the extent that you can make the mistake that this is God. This is the creator. To that extent that you can make that mistake, but it is simultaneously infinitely distant from God. To understand this, we have to do a bit of a divergent, discuss another topic. Let's ask a question. Is creation a mistake, or is it as God desires? And why is this an important question, as we will see? If we go with Rambam, then what happens? Okay, so it makes sense. God manages and creates the world from his knowledge. So to speak, whatever God thinks about happens. Um, God is one with this. So obviously, whatever happens is based on God's knowledge. God knows what's happening and God wants this to happen, and this is what happens. Okay, so it all makes sense. But what happens if we go with the idea of the Maharal that says that God is completely beyond any specific definitions? So what does that mean? That God is completely beyond all of reality. Knowledge is created by God. So the question is, how do you get from this infinite being suddenly a specific reality? Was that intentional? And if it was intentional, doesn't that mean that it was already inside of that being, that infinite being called God? And if so, does that mean there's multiplicity, that there's something in God, which is one with God? According to Maharal, you can't say that there's anything within God. And to respond to this, we will now go into a Kabbalistic exploration of the concept called will, which is desire. And that's going to be slightly different than the concept of knowledge, because knowledge is a type of relationship where you relate to something based off a certain set of rules. You know what it is. There's something else, and you know what that is. You're relating to that thing as a separate thing. What is a desire? A desire is something that you relate to on your own terms, not on that thing's terms. In other words, that thing has its parameters. The desire is, I want. I don't care about that thing's parameters. It's just, this is what I want. And that's how God creates. Now let's explore this concept, which is going to be based off that source. We will notice that there's a question that arises when we say that God has a desire, a will. And that question is, does creation cause change in God? You're saying that God has a will which was not there before. So if it was not there before, what does that mean? That suddenly, so to speak, one day, God decided to want to have something. So what changed all of a sudden? If you say that God's will was always there, then you have a problem. Why? Because that's like saying that God isn't affected by creation. You're saying that, so there's God and his will, and so to speak, God's will go ahead and create. So that's almost like saying that God assigned someone else to create. But really, there's another problem with that, and that is that you're saying that there's something else besides for God that was always one with God. And the only thing that is truly infinite and that always existed is God's true singularity. So what do you gain by saying that there was always that will there? But does that mean that God's will is involuntary? If God's will was always there, does that mean that it must exist? And if it must exist, does that mean that God doesn't have another choice? We can't say that about God. So there's a bit of a problem with this whole concept of God's will. And just to give a bit of a depiction of why this is a problem, us humans, we need to breathe. We always need to breathe. We have many different needs. When we need to eat, and those are things that we want. We want to eat, but why do we need to eat? Because we need it. And those needs, those wants are always there within us. We always want to breathe. We always want to eat. Even when we've just eaten, there's still that will inside of us that knows that we need to eat. We always need to have food. So can you say this about God, that there was always this will within him to create? That's almost like saying that God needs to create. So there's a bit of a problem here. So for this, Kabbalah explains the concept of light. And we'll be touching a bit on that concept of what light is. And the will of God, God's desire, comes from his light. So it is true that God's will, God's desire, was not always there within him. It is something new. It's a creation. God's drive, so to speak, to go and create this world is a creation of God. It's not infinite. It's not eternal. It does not bind, God forbid, God's hands, so to speak. God is completely free to operate beyond it, so to speak, because it comes from his light. But what is this light? That's what we're going to have to figure out. So a will, I just touched on this a bit. A will is a drive. A will means you're going to get something. There's something that you want to have in something else. So it is true that a will, a desire, is different than knowledge in the sense that knowledge is bound by the parameters of the things that you know. You know exactly what it is. You can't change what you know about it because whatever the parameters of that thing are true. And if you're going to know them, then you're going to know what it tells you. A desire, a will, is what I want. I can decide what I want. And if I want to create something in a different way, so we're basically like saying that God can want to have the parameters in a different way. So to speak, gives more freedom to God. That's what a will, a desire is. But that's a drive where you're relating. You want to have something else. What is light? Light is different than that because light is a reflection. It's not that you're going and you're interested in something else. It's that you exist and there's a reflection coming off you. We've spoken a bit about this in our last live stream, in our last class, and we have a couple of videos discussing this concept of light, this energy, this reflection of godliness. So, in short, what is God's light? Let's think of it like sunlight. The sun shines freely to all of reality. And it's automatic. The sun is not going out of its way to give less light to people who need less and more light to people who need more. It is true that there is regulation of sunlight in this world, but that's because the atmosphere, as we spoke about in last class, and that's because we have window shades and we cover ourselves with clothing to protect us from the sun. So we regulate the light coming from the sun. But the sun itself is shining light infinitely in all directions. But the sun's light is involuntary. It's automatic. And here's the distinction with God's light, which God's light is by choice. And we're going to have to use a bit of imagination over here. And we need to understand that the reason that we're choosing to use the word light because of the benefits the word light gives us to talk about these different topics about God. But because God is completely beyond all of reality, completely beyond human existence, creates all of the parameters and all the definitions and logic in our human experience, we have to understand that no specific concept or definition that we come up with as humans is going to be perfect to explain how God operates or why things happen like that with God. So the way we could describe how creation happens from God is by using the word light, but adding one snippet, and that is that God's light is by choice. It's not involuntary. Alrighty, so what do we have over here? So, summary, we have been speaking about, spoke about Rambam, how Maimonides describes God as a unified being with knowledge. In other words, the only tool, so to speak, that God has to relate to the world, create it and operate it and know what's happening with the world is the tool called knowledge. But there can't be multiplicity in God, so everything is unified with God. God is one with his knowledge. Maharal came and said, you can't say that. You can't say that God is one with a tool. Instead, God creates that tool called knowledge to relate to the world. God is completely beyond that. But then we ran into a problem. What is causing creation? So we went into a discussion of what will is, what is desire, and there was a bit of a problem with desire on its own. And then we came across the concept of light. And now we kind of have a good picture, a good way for us to say how God is completely pure, completely infinite, completely beyond, creates all of creation voluntarily, purposely. And then there's a will, and then there's creation, and everything happens from God voluntarily and meaningfully. So, a short summary before we continue. We have God in his essence, which cannot be changed. And we have God's light, God's expression. And a way to think of that is that you just have that God shines, so to speak, automatically, but voluntarily. So God is not affected by the fact that he's shining, somewhat of how the sun is not affected by the fact that it shines. And okay, I put this in parentheses, tzimtzum, because we're not really going to be talking about it. But if you look in between the lines, you'll notice that we are covering this. Tzimtzum basically means that God's infinite light, because God's light is a reflection of what he is, so that becomes contracted and minimized, as we'll see, to create a specific will, a specific desire. So God is infinite, God can do anything, and then you have a specific will, a specific desire. So that means it's a contracted version. It's a minimized version of God's infinite light. It's only one strand of light. It's not all of God's ability. So that's why we put the tzimtzum over there. The fact that God's infinite light is condensed, so to speak, into a specific will to have a specific world created. And then we have Atzilus. We have an actual blueprint of creation, an actual set of tools, so to speak, which are created by God, which will be used to go ahead and create the universe. So what do we have? We have now, finally, we can understand. So we have the light of God, which is a small strand of light, which unifies with vessels. What are vessels? Vessels are these tools, these specific abilities. Like we said, knowledge is a tool, so to speak, of how God knows what's happening in the world. And we know that one of the 10 sefirot is kindness. So kindness is a tool of how God will relate to the world in a way of being kind. In other words, sharing and flowing. And then we know that there's severity. God will know how to restrain and restrict revelation coming from God into the world. Those are the different abilities in these 10 sefirot, which are elaborated in our other classes, other videos. And these become one with God. And how is that possible? Because God's light, God's expression, which is an expression of exactly what God is, unifies and becomes one with these abilities. While God's essence remains completely beyond, completely untouched. And now, even God's light, in other words, God's expression, as we said before, remains infinite. Remains infinite. And why is that? Because, as we said, only a speck of light, only a small strand of this infinite expression of God comes and unifies with Atzilus to create. Over here, we made this depiction of the word God, and then we have that Atzilus icon really tiny to show how it's only a very small strand, a small sprinkle of energy, which is coming from God's infinite expression, God's infinite ability, which is going to go ahead and create the world. Now, obviously, God is beyond time and space, and God is infinitely beyond. As we said, God is infinite. God himself, and even God's infinite light, is infinitely beyond these specific 10 abilities of creating the world. But nonetheless, God unifies with them to the extent that, as we said, we have the Rambam, we have Maimonides, which to a certain extent thought of this situation of God's abilities as God himself. Because, as we said, God needs to be one, singular. You can't have multiplicity. So if God relates to the world, that means God is one with his ability to relate to the world, which he defined as knowledge. But as we're learning over here, God could be completely beyond, infinitely beyond that, and nonetheless unify with these abilities in order to go ahead and create. You can check those sources. Now, I'm going to explain to you how I think of Hishtalshlus. which means that the cosmic, all these different levels, the cosmic evolution of spiritual realms, as is discussed in Kabbalah. So I don't think of it as a sequence of levels and different stages. When you study Kabbalah, you can think, okay, so there's God, and then there's the infinite light of God, the infinite expression of God, and then there's a tzimtzum, there's a contraction. God conceals himself, so to speak, removes himself, and then brings in a small strand of light, of energy into the world, into the empty space, so to speak. And then God creates this will from that, and then God creates these tools to relate to the world. That's not necessarily the correct way to think of what's going on over here. Instead, how I think of it is just think of a simple situation. God created us. God creates the world. That's all that happens. Whatever you thought before, whatever you thought when you were a little child, learning about God, God created the world. That's it. That's it that happened. There's God. He's infinite power, infinite ability, and God created the world. But it was intentional, right? It wasn't a mistake. Meaning that there's a vision within God of how creation will look, what will happen with creation. And then that vision goes ahead and creates the world. So the moment of creation, in other words, the act of God creating the world, there's no act. The fact that God creates the world means that there's a point of fusion. There's a place where God creates the world. In other words, where God's energy is contracted enough to relate to very specific beings in this world. God created your brain, and God wants your brain to be exactly as your brain is. God wanted the trees to look exactly as the trees are. So that means that God programmed energy to fit exactly for all of these things. That is Atzilus. That is what this world of God's tools, so to speak, is. We shouldn't think of it that God created tools in order to create the world. God wanted to create the world. And when God creates the worlds, there's that point of fusion. There's this place where God is right now creating the world. In other words, specific things. In other words, these specific things in that action of creation exist right there in God. That's not God's essence. That's, as we said, that's a reflection of God, an expression of God, which manifests in the form of a will, of a vision, which manifests into tools of creation. And here's this is not sourced. This is just something I thought of. Think of a clock ticking. So let's not think of those clocks, which the minute handle just continues going the seconds. Let's think of the seconds going tick, tick, tick. So unless you have a very slow motion camera, it will just seem that the seconds, the hand went from one place and suddenly appeared in another place, right? So that's kind of how I'm thinking of creation. You have God, and then you have creation. Atzilus is the invisible moment in between. In other words, there's from one moment to the next, the clock handle went all that direction. So what do we know as humans? We know that we exist, and we know that God must exist. We must come from somewhere. And we shouldn't create more layers and levels, but we do understand that there is a layer, that at the moment of creation, something happened. And what happened? God was relating to the world at that moment. And that is what Atzilus is. Atzilus is God relating to the world. But we must remember that that stage, that level, is infinitely far, so to speak, from God, to the extent that it's further than our relationship to that level. And by the way, that level is no small thing. This is, in the Rambam's eyes, God himself. And we know that the Alter Rebbe, whenever that he barely uttered this word Atzilus, here I am saying it as if it's just a nice word. But people who really connected with the deep energy and the deep understanding of what these things really are, they wouldn't even utter this word because of its holiness and how they would think of it. So Atzilus is there. And now the big question of why. Why did God go ahead and create everything? Why did creation even exist? Why did God allow his light. As we said, the light is voluntary. God chooses, God allows for this to happen. God wants this to happen. God programs it to happen in a specific way. Why does God do this? This is a question which everybody's asking, and I've seen a lot of people asking it recently. So let's think about this for a second. If God created us for a reason, and when I say a reason, what I mean is that to accomplish something specific. So, for example, us humans, we eat. Why do we eat? Because we need to have food. So when we eat, we accomplish the fact that we needed to eat, and otherwise we would go hungry. And when we breathe, we fill a need within us to go ahead and breathe. So that's a reason. Everything has a cause and an effect. That's what I mean to say. There's a cause and an effect. So if God created us as an effect coming from a cause, and what would that be? That would be the world of Atzilus, because Atzilus is the ability to go ahead and create. So if you have this ability to create and you don't create, then the cause was never brought into actuation. There was no effect that ever came from it. So when creation is created by this ability to create, that ability is fulfilled, so to speak. But if it's not, then it's left unfulfilled. So what comes out? Comes out that Atzilus must, so to speak, create, if we think of it in this way. So let's say we accept that. That's the reason. So this God creates these abilities and creates us. But the reason itself is created by God. But God himself is untouched. God is unchanged. So the question is, first of all, why did this even happen to begin with? And is this really so meaningful? So obviously it is very meaningful. Even if we're created to fulfill the cause of creation, in other words, that ability of creation, it is very meaningful to us as humans, because us as humans, we're limited, we're physical, we don't have any value on our own without God's infinite spirituality. So by God allowing us to relate to this infinite spirituality, there's obviously something that we gain out of it. But is it worthy on an essential level? Is it independently something beautiful? In other words, why did God actually create that situation where there are humans which can benefit from this? Why did that even happen to begin with? So the ultimate reason, which is brought in modern Kabbalah, which is Hasidus, the Alter Rebbe's Tanya, all the way down to the Rebbe's Sichos, that creation for no reason is greater and deeper than creation with a reason. Because as we said, if we're created because of a reason, in other words, if we fulfill something in a cause, something that needed to create us in order for us to accomplish something within that, then all we accomplish is whatever that cause needed. So we're saying over here something very deep, and that is that creation for no reason is much deeper and greater than creation with a reason. And why is that? Let's think about it for a second. God is completely beyond everything. God exists independently of anything else. God doesn't need anything to exist. Let's imagine a scenario where God needs us to exist. So God creates us. So if God creates us for a specific need, then we fulfill that need within God. But that means that there's God and his need. Like we spoke about the desire beforehand. There's a desire. So if there's God and his desire, then perhaps we can fulfill the desire, that lack, so to speak, God forbid, within God. But God himself, does God in essence need to have us? And the answer would be no. It's only God's will, God's desire that needs us. It's only that lack, that void, which needs us. But if we say that God created us for no reason, and what does no reason mean? No reason means no cause. There's nothing that brought us into existence. If God created us for no reason, then what does that mean? That means that creation is coming from God's essence himself for no reason. There's no cause. There's no void. There's no lack which we fulfill within God. God's essence chose to create us and bring us forth. And this is explained in Kabbalah, as you can see in that source. Creation comes from the power of God. And it's precisely because there's no reason that this is such a powerful concept. And it's precisely for that reason that we can connect with God in essence, beyond any reasons and needs, beyond our human existence. So I just want to elaborate a little bit more on that concept of why God created all of reality. That if it was because of a reason, then it's something, then it's like a void. Think about us humans. When we need to do anything, we do it, and then we fulfill a void within ourselves. But with God, if you say that God didn't need to create us, but he created us, then let's think about this for a second. Why did God create us? And the answer is God created us because of his essence. There is no, and delete the word because. In other words, God's essence created us for no reason. It doesn't need us. He doesn't lose anything if he lacks us. But it's his essence. It's from the beauty and perfection of his essence that he created us. And when we fulfill our mission in this world, to make this world a better place, we complete a mission in that essence. And this is obviously a very deep topic. And this is being touched on very shortly in this class, and much thought needs to be put into it. So I hope everybody will continue diving deep into these deep topics. And we will be putting out a few videos sooner or later on these topics. So I hope everybody stays tuned. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Hope everybody enjoyed and learned something new. And we'll see you next time. All right, bye-bye.